I'm pleased to welcome as our guest speaker Nancy MacLean. She is the William Chafe Professor of History and Public Policy at Duke University. She is the past president of the Labor and Working Class History Association. She is the author of a number of books, including works about the working class in this country, the making of the second Ku Klux Klan, and Freedom is Not Enough. Those are the titles of some of her books. She's also served as the editor of Scalawag, a white Southerner's journey through segregation to human rights activism. But she is here to talk about her newest book called Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America. And I'm very pleased to welcome Nancy here and all of you who have come to hear her.
Over the last year in particular, for anyone who was not paying attention, it has become ever more obvious that American politics are in crisis. And a government that was once said to be of, by, and for the people is in crisis. We have reached the point that even elementary norms of civic decency and truth are in crisis. You know this. But what you may be struggling to figure out is how we got here and what that means. This watershed that we've reached in our public life has been fed by many streams, of course. They include the kind of movement conservatism that made Barry Goldwater the Republican candidate just after he voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Another and related stream is the religious right that has grown so much over the last few decades. There is also the white supremacist right that has resurfaced with a vengeance of late. All of these are important, and the first two in particular have produced the votes to effect radical policy change. But I'm here tonight to talk to you about another piece of the puzzle of how we got into the dangerous situation in which we now find ourselves, a missing piece. And that is the ideas that are guiding the billionaire-funded libertarian right, made popular or notorious, depending on your perspective, by Charles Koch. And I believe that this is a crucial missing piece because it explains so much that otherwise remains mysterious. I believe it's also crucial because knowing about this history may equip citizens, like those of you here tonight, to lead the way out of this mess before it is too late. As a public health nurse who read the book and wrote to me expressed it, you need to get the diagnosis right before you can determine the best treatment plan. Because there's an unmarked hazard in our situation right now, and that is that the noisiest threats are getting the most attention. Among them, the now chronic bullying and race baiting coming from the White House. Another, even more extreme plan is moving along apace. In the 30 states, now totally dominated by this cause, in federal and state departments and agencies, and in the courts. This plan is being pursued by a much smaller cause, but one that is archly determined and breathtakingly well-funded. And this cause's architects aim to rewrite the rules of our society permanently. I'll state my case simply. Behind all the seeming chaos and dysfunction in our public life right now, there is a strategy in play. A cold-eyed, calculated strategy. And that strategy is quite far along. One of its field generals said this in late 2015, and I quote, "We are close to winning. They," he was referring to the critics of the Koch donor network, but we could say the rest of the citizenry, "they don't have the real path. They don't have the real path." That was Mark Holden, the head of Koch Industries Government and Public Affairs operation, gloating to an invitation-only summit of billionaire and multimillionaire donors. Now, you've all heard a lot in the last several years about the fortune that Charles Koch has been investing in our politics, and one of the best writers on that has been the New Yorker's own Jane Mayer. But what you've likely not heard about is the ideas that have lately made those investments so devastatingly effective. Charles Koch, who has 3 engineering degrees from MIT, refers to these ideas as a technology. And I learned that it was an academic economist who taught Charles Koch that for capitalism of the variety that they would like to see to thrive, democracy must be enchained. So my book, Democracy in Chains, thus provides the backstory to this defining moment in which we find ourselves, as it explains that real path to which Mark Holden referred. In its essence, the book is a story of two men, a thinker and a CEO, whose lives converge through a shared commitment to transform the model of government that our country built up over the 20th century, particularly through citizen activism of different kinds. The thinker was a Tennessee-born economist, James McGill Buchanan, who spent most of his career, ironically, in Virginia public institutions. The CEO is, of course, the Kansas-based Charles Koch, who spent most of his adult life, when he wasn't making Koch Industries into one of the largest privately held corporations in the world, spent most of his adult life, by his own definition, obsessively looking for a technology that could enable him to make our country and the world, in fact, conform to his arch vision of economic liberty, a kind of free-rein capitalism beyond the reach of voters and their governments. So the history that my book conveys is first of the crucible in which James McGill Buchanan came up with this idea of enchaining democracy to insulate economic liberty. And that was as the civil rights movement was making headway on his own campus at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville in the late 1950s and early 60s, in the state of Virginia, and in the nation as a whole. The story then shifts to how Charles Koch began funding an apparatus to make that idea a reality in a messianic quest that has produced the volatile situation we are now confronting. It's not a comforting story, I have to say that. I've had some readers compare it to a Stephen King novel, which I've not read Stephen King, but I take the point. But I also think, both as a scholar and as a citizen, that understanding what we're really up against is crucial to being able to defend a democracy that many of us can now see is facing truly existential threat. And so tonight what I'd like to do is share with you the story of how I stumbled on the trail that led me to these stark conclusions. Because I think that knowing the route that led me to what I've just said will give you an even sharper sense of the stakes of all of this. Because it turns out that what we are seeing now, what we have seen in the last year, is not the first time that the libertarian right has shown itself willing to exploit white supremacy to advance a cause I've come to think about as property supremacy. A property supremacy that will affect us all in the end, whatever our demographics, whatever our backgrounds and current status, we will all be affected by this agenda. So what led me to these conclusions? In a word, serendipity. I started the research that became this book in 2006, and at that time I had never heard of James Buchanan, so don't feel bad if you haven't either. And I'd also never heard of Charles Koch, because almost none of us had if we weren't in the fossil fuel industry or the libertarian movement. But I was actually following a different story at that point, and it was the tragic story of Prince Edward County, Virginia, whose white county officials answered the call of the Supreme Court to desegregate its public schools without further delay by, as the white county leaders put it, and I quote, going out of the public school business entirely. They shut down the entire public school system of Prince Edward County. They left black children with no formal education whatsoever for 5 years, children who were just about to start first grade and who were approaching their last year of high school, as the county's white children headed off to a private segregation academy with state-subsidized tuition grants, what we would today call vouchers. And the county officials kept these schools closed for 5 years until the courts compelled them to reinstate a school system. It shocked me, as someone who's a historian of social movements in the United States, who's done a lot of work on the South, to learn about this story. I was embarrassed that I had never come across it before. And I began to dig in. I had found the papers at the American Friends Service Committee archives in Philadelphia. And fairly early on, I learned that these school vouchers were crucial to the story of the state of Virginia's massive resistance to Brown and its leadership, its goading of the rest of the South to this massive resistance. And I also learned that the University of Chicago economist Milton Friedman had issued his first manifesto for school vouchers in 1955 in the full knowledge of how it would be used by segregationist whites in the South. Yes, my reaction too. And I know that he understood that because he was challenged by a liberal economist who was editing the volume in which he placed this manifesto, and that good liberal economist asked all the questions you or I might and issued all the challenges, and Friedman would have none of it. He wanted to go forward with his plan. So he became part of my story, which I began to see was a very different account of this free market fundamentalism that we've seen so much of in recent decades, a story that nobody knew about the time that this first acquired a mass base. But in following a footnote, I learned of another report, a 1959 report, as this threat from Prince Edward County was in the air to close their schools that fall when they finally were pushed to desegregate. And this other report came from two economists who had been trained at the University of Chicago, had worked with Friedman and others there, but they'd gone on to set up a center at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville in 1956, one of them being this James McGill Buchanan. And the timing of their report was very important because that fall, the fall of 1958, the governor had used what today is being called preemption to shut schools in any community in Virginia that planned to comply with the courts and desegregate their school systems. And by shutting those schools, the governor locked 13,000 white children out of schooling for the whole fall of 1958, because after all, it was their schools that were being sued to desegregate. So 13,000 white kids were locked out of school, again at all levels, and this set off a movement of liberal clergy and particularly white mothers, moderate white mothers and liberal clergy who were trying to save Virginia's public school system. And the argument that they made was that we already have a beggared system of public schools. If you set up a second one, it will bleed away resources and destroy the public system. So these two economists wanted to rebut these moderates, and by the way, 150 fellow faculty members at their own university who also supported the moderate case. And they issued a report that basically said that the moderates had the math wrong, that if the state sold off all its school facilities to private operators, well then they could provide better education at less cost with more choice and no monopoly, all the kinds of arguments that we hear today. So in effect, their report called for privatizing schools before that verb even existed in our national vocabulary. And they did so in the full knowledge that the schools funded in this way would be white segregation academies, because these were the only private schools in question. Black parents and their organizations opposed the vouchers to a person, seeing them as an insult to the constitutional dignity that had just been recognized in the Brown decision. Now, needless to say, as a university professor myself, it stunned me to see two faculty members making a case for what their state's most arch segregationists were seeking. And it intrigued me that they did so not in racist terms, but in economic terms, consciously leveraging the authority of their discipline at the state's flagship campus in Charlottesville to back up what the most anti-democratic figures of the day were seeking. Buchanan and his colleague Warren Nutter knew that they were exploiting the rage of white supremacists to move their libertarian economic agenda, one they referred to as the Free Society, even as they showed no sympathy whatsoever for the civil rights activists, even on their own campus, whose mantra was freedom now. Their cover letter to the legislators they were seeking to move actually said that they were issuing this report, and I quote, letting the chips fall where they may, letting the chips fall where they may. And that phrase just lodged itself in my gut and made me feel a need to learn more about who they were. Because obviously, with that phrase, they were acting with full awareness of the harm they would be inflicting. And as an educator myself, I wondered how anybody could do such a thing. Not in an irrational frenzy, not the kind of stereotypes that we might have of who Southern segregationists were, but actually in cold-eyed calculation to move a broader agenda. So, and there's James Buchanan with the quote. My curiosity piqued by all this, I began seeking more information about this Buchanan and quickly learned that he had won the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 1986. He was awarded it for having pioneered a new way of thinking that was called public choice economics. I learned that it also became influential in political science and law, and also among activists and elected officials on the right. Now, what Buchanan did that was new was, in his words, the economic analysis of politics. But it was unlike other forms of economic analysis of politics, because what it did was apply Chicago and Austrian-style economic assumptions to political actors to say that we could only understand them as individuals. Not people seeking the common good, not people seeking the public interest, not acting on behalf of, maybe it was workers in a union or civil rights, activists. No, these were individuals seeking to advance their own personal self-interest, and that's how they had to be understood. So from this, Buchanan developed a new explanation of deficits that solved a puzzle that many Keynesian economists had not, which is how governments continued to overspend, right, to spend more than they took in, even in times of prosperity, not just times of depression. He basically argued that it was in politicians' interest to make promises that cost money to multiple constituencies in order to get reelected. As someone whose specialty was public finance, thinking about taxation and government spending, arguably, I believe, the least sexy and the most important fields of our time, but he identified with the political right and was determined to find ways to lower taxes and shrink the public sector. And with this field of public choice economics, he turned new attention to what he liked to call the rules of the game of politics, to thinking about the spending incentives of the political process and how changing the rules of the process could yield different outcomes. And I want to be clear and say this is a broader school of thought. For example, President Obama's point person for regulation, Cass Sunstein, a law professor at Harvard, has found these ideas useful, has offered some suggestions for how to improve, for example, public health with them. But I also learned in the course of researching this that Buchanan's stream of this public choice economics, what was called the Virginia School of Economics, was always distinctive. And Buchanan himself said, looking back in a documentary filmed in 2007, that his goal was, as he put it, to tear down the very idea of the public interest. Why, I thought, would anyone want to do that? To tear down the idea that elected officials try to serve the public interest or the common good? Reading more, I learned that to a libertarian like Buchanan, there is no common good. In his view, and that of his fellows, any such notion of shared purpose is just a fiction that enables government to coerce those who don't agree with the majority. So democracy, Buchanan and his colleagues argued, violates the individual liberty of the minority. And the only minority that I have found that he seemed to be consistently concerned with was wealthy taxpayers and corporations who didn't share the majority's view of the public interest. Government, Buchanan and his colleagues argued, all but steals the property of such people if it taxes them for purposes they don't share. And he could be quite agitational, even in scholarly writing about this, in a work that he said summed up his whole research program, published in 1975 during the crime panic in New York in particular. He said, "What difference is there between a thug who steals my wallet in Central Park and a government that taxes me for purposes I don't share?" So quite blunt about it. So basically, he was at pains to insist that we are not our brother's keepers, or at least we should not be able to use government to shift tax revenues from one citizen to another. He also, and this is a hallmark of this Virginia school, came to talk about all of this in very stark and foreboding terms that in fact are now widespread on the right owing to decades of inculcation by Buchanan and his colleagues and the think tanks with which they worked. A case in point. How many people remember Mitt Romney on the campaign trail in 2012 at a $50,000 a plate dinner, dismissing the 47% he said would never vote for him because they were too dependent on government? People remember that? A lot of people think that cost Romney the election. What we didn't understand at the time, though, is that Romney was not inventing a new idea with this. By that point, the Heritage Foundation was maintaining what they call the annual index of dependency to actually try to separate makers and takers, those who are the taxpayers who give more than they believe they give back, and those of us who receive more from government than we put in. And I learned that it was Buchanan whose school of thought gave scholarly imprimatur to all this. Buchanan himself spoke of net tax recipients, again, people who get more from government than they pay in taxes, as, and I quote, parasites on the productive. He warned of predators and prey. The predators being, say, for example, senior citizens seeking a prescription drug benefit, maybe environmentalists trying to get their state government to clean up a local waterway, public school teachers trying to get smaller class sizes, etc. All of these people were predators, and the prey were those unwilling taxpayers. So, as someone who'd also worked on the far right, what today is called the alt-right, I recognize this as a dehumanizing vocabulary, right? I mean, it is making fellow citizens look like menaces from the animal world. It's a vocabulary that is disinhibiting. It's a vocabulary that licenses hostility to one's fellow citizens. And I think we're all probably aware, when you think about it, that this language is rife on the American right today. As I read more, I learned also that for those who think this way, justice is a pretty simple matter. I keep what I earn, you keep what you earn. That's justice. And you collectively can only legitimately tax me if I agree with your goals and methods. And here's Buchanan's colleague, Walter Williams, saying this on the Conservative Political Action Conference campaign trail. But Buchanan himself did not stop there with this diagnosis. And by the way, I have to say this is all at the level of theory. There's no empirical grounding to Buchanan's work. But believing this way, he moved in the 1970s from scholarship to organizing. He began urging right-wing donors and corporations that he was in touch with to build what he called a counterintelligentsia. And the way he urged them to do this was by creating, in his words, a gravy train. A gravy train that he said would bring men into the fold, get them committed to a set of ideas, and then be able to train them to go out and do battle for these ideas. As he organized, he also shifted from diagnosis, from analysis, to prescription, to saying what should be done. He moved into a field that he called constitutional economics. He believed that by this measure of protecting the unwealthy minority of taxpayers, all constitutions in the world were failures. Every constitution in the world was a failure. That's how radical this vision is, because they did not adequately protect the wealthy. So he set out to design a legal regime that could protect capitalism from government, as some of his colleagues put it, that could enshrine the rights of this wealthy minority over the rest of the citizenry to a degree no society anywhere had ever seen, which sounds crazy until you realize it's been done. He found an eager audience for these ideas among some generals in need of a new constitution in Chile. In 1980, the military junta of General Augusto Pinochet, knowing that they would have to return at some point to elected rule, but wanting to keep the things they'd done while they had decimated popular power and accountability and control in the society, invited Buchanan to Santiago to try out these ideas for how to devise a constitution that would protect capitalism from government. And the result of that advice is still in effect today in Chile. In 2013, Michelle Bachelet, who was actually a child of someone who'd been tortured by the Pinochet regime, was elected president by 2/3 of the Chilean people on a wide-ranging reform platform to reverse what the dictatorship had done. It had privatized Social Security so that many people lost their life savings and were gouged by the financial sector that was taking their monies now. It had privatized education in a way that made Chile's higher education system the most expensive in the developed world, and those were just some of the things that were spurring mass protests. So she got 2/3 of the vote, came in trying to act on what she had promised the people. And she quickly learned that that Constitution would not allow her to do it. It's called the Constitution of Liberty. And she said it put locks and bolts on what elected officials can do. She said, we need a Constitution without locks and bolts. Sadly, this story is not of purely historical interest. That kind of Constitution with locks and bolts is now coming to America, thanks to pressure from the Koch donor network and its allies in the trenches who are determined to achieve the kind of binding change Buchanan urged, in the full knowledge that their ideas and their endgame are not popular, so they're not informing the public of their true goals, but instead working behind the scenes. And Charles Koch actually recognized this in 1997 when he really set out to build this machine, a decade before President Obama was elected. He said, since we are greatly outnumbered, the failure to use our superior technology ensures failure. Basically, what he was talking about was weaponizing Buchanan's ideas. And thanks to assiduous organizing by the apparatus that the donor network that he has convened funds, above all the American Legislative Exchange Council that you probably have heard of as ALEC, and a Republican Party that these donors have all but taken over and turned into a delivery vehicle with a threat of primary challenges from the right, this cause now has in place 28 of the 34 states' authorizations needed to call a constitutional convention authorized by the states. Just to be clear, as a historian, on how radical this prospect is, we have never had a state called constitutional convention to amend the Constitution in America. By definition, it would be a runaway convention. Even conservative justices said it was a crazy idea, but it may be a year or 2 or 3 away at the rate that things are going. Now, you might be wondering how I put together the way that Buchanan's ideas were guiding the real path the Koch donor network is following to shackle our democracy. And the answer is, again, coincidence. I moved to North Carolina in 2010. At that point, I was still focused on the Freedmen story, but I knew Buchanan was important and I was trying to learn more. But that was just the exact fall when a radicalized Republican Party dominated by Koch-supported Tea Party figures won majorities in both houses of the North Carolina state legislature. And suddenly, the things I was reading about in Buchanan's work that still seemed so abstract became concrete as the General Assembly's lead donor boasted of the big bang his grantees were developing to make this once moderate state, again, a boast, a laboratory for the cause, using this technology that came from public choice economics. Some of you may have read Jane Mayer's piece called State for Sale on what happened to North Carolina. That man on the side there in the cartoon had been working with the Koch since the 1980s and is the lead right-wing donor in North Carolina, having built up an apparatus of think tanks and other organizations. Okay, so what did I see happening in the shock and awe style Big Bang in North Carolina? First, I should explain that Buchanan long advised those he worked with, his colleagues and the right-wing organizations with which he worked, that if they didn't like the outcome of public policy over a long period of time, they should stop thinking about who rules, personalities, political party, forget it. Stop thinking about who rules and think about the rules. And his argument became that if you wanted to see the kind of radical change that these libertarians wanted to see, then what you need to do was focus laser-like on changing the rules, on figuring out what rules would prevent those kinds of policies from being enacted. And what I watched unfold in North Carolina after those midterm elections of 2010 was a stunning barrage of radical rules changes on this model, one after another. I can't even tell you them all. They go on to 3 or 4 pages, but I'll just give you a few of the most striking. The most radical gerrymander in American history to misrepresent the will of the electorate, so that these Republican officials could choose their voters rather than the voters choosing those who would represent them. New measures to undermine workers' ability to come together in labor unions, particularly public sector unions. Attacks on public education at all levels and radical cuts in funding for it and sharp changes to university governance. Repeal of a hard-won Racial Justice Act to ensure fairness in policing and the criminal justice system. Refusal to accept the Medicaid expansion of the Affordable Care Act despite a crying need for it in our low-wage state. Rolling back measures to protect the environment and reduce global warming. And in all of these things, breaking with customary governing practices like public hearings before passing legislation and transparency about the process. Instead, they worked with breakneck speed and often carefully guarded secrecy. And then, to cap it all off, when they got the governorship too, what has come to be known as the Monster Voter Suppression Bill, which in some 15 different ways was designed to reduce turnout from people who would oppose this agenda. Absolutely African Americans and other people of color, but also students. Not legally actionable, but they took dead aim at students because they knew young people didn't support this agenda. And also even things like early voting that were popular with their own Republican voters. What proved so surreal to me in all of this, as a scholar who is also experiencing all this as a citizen, was that I could see that this new Republican majority was applying Buchanan's ideas to get what they otherwise could not, certainly not if they'd campaigned openly for these measures and called for them by name. But also unsettling was how critics of all of this, good people, many of them who had become my friends, who had worked in the nonprofit sector for years, who loved their state of North Carolina, who took pride in it being the most progressive state in the South, having clawed its way up in the bottom through investments in public schools and roads and all that good stuff. People couldn't see the deep operational strategy that unified all these varied measures. They couldn't see that the men who were pushing this agenda were not misinformed about the likely consequences of the agenda they were pushing. These men, and it was mostly men, I have to say, they fully understood that it would inflict grievous harm on many of their fellow citizens. They knew that thousands of people would die for lack of health insurance because of the refusal of the Medicaid expansion. They knew that students' learning would be stunted by what was being done in the schools, but they believed their endgame was worth the price. They were, you could say, in cold calculation, once again, letting the chips fall where they may. And what my fellow critics of all of this also could not see, and I understand why they couldn't, but they couldn't see that this agenda was backed by an ethical system that gave these actors confidence and let them feel heroic enough to weather the criticism and opposition they were getting. And I understand why people couldn't see that, because it's an ethical system that's foreign to most of us. It's in fact at odds with the best of every major religious tradition in the world. But it's a system that has its own stark coherence that we need to understand if we are going to be able to deal with the crisis that the combination of Buchanan's ideas and Koch's money has created. I want to read you a passage. Since we are here in a house of faith, I thought rather than describe it abstractly, I'd let you hear from Buchanan in his own words about this ethical system. So it's just a few paragraphs. In the same year he attended the founding seminar of what became the Cato Institute, James Buchanan published an article called The Samaritan's Dilemma, a piece that has been used by the right ever since to show that the ethics of Jesus, as reported in the Gospel of Luke, produced perverse results in the modern world. Buchanan summarized this piece of what he called prescriptive diagnosis thus. He said, and I quote, "We may simply be too compassionate for our own well-being or for that of an orderly and productive free society." Modern man, he went on to say, and this is a quote, has become incapable of making the choices that are required to prevent his exploitation by predators of his own species, whether the predation be conscious or unconscious. Predators of his own species? It was a perverse application of the parable of the Good Samaritan, in which a kind resident of Samaria comes to the aid of a Jewish traveler who has been stripped, robbed, beaten, and left to die. In the story that Jesus used to show his followers that one should love one's neighbor as himself, even when the suffering neighbor was a member of a despised outgroup, as Jews were to Samaritans. But in the view of the libertarian economists, Jesus was mistaken. Conscripting the Good Samaritan story, Buchanan made the case that, and I quote, modern man had gone soft. He lacks the strategic courage needed to restore the market to its proper ordering. By this logic, what seemed the ethical thing to do, to help someone in need, was not, after all, the correct thing to do, because the assistants could encourage the recipient to exploit the giver rather than solve his own problems. Buchanan used as an analogy the spanking of children by parents. It might hurt, he said, but it taught, quote, the fear of punishment that will inhibit future misbehavior. More than any piece, this article captured the stark morality of libertarianism. It is an ethical system that deems it better to have people die from lack of health care than to receive it from government, from taxes paid for by others. I learned all of this and more in 2013 when James Buchanan died, and finally that September I was able to get access to his private archive at George Mason University. And as I went through his papers going back to the 1950s, I found my developing understanding of all of this confirmed, and confirmed in a way that sometimes literally left me breathless. I will give you an example. In his private office, I found stacked helter-skelter on a chair a pile of documents that exposed how Charles Koch and many of his most trusted leading operatives had cooperated with George Mason University economics faculty and the president and the provost of this institution of public higher education just across the Potomac from Washington, D.C., to establish a base camp for this political project. And I found in this research that it wasn't just James Buchanan that Charles Koch could count on at George Mason. There were many others. Among them was a man named Henry Manny, whom Buchanan had arranged the hire of as the dean of George Mason's law school, now named the Scalia School of Law. With Koch funding, it was renamed. And Henry Manny, it turns out, had been running a summer program for federal judges since the early 1970s with Koch's financial backing. And by the time Charles Koch made this big contribution, the first of many, he's now George Mason's biggest donor. By the time he made this contribution, first $10 million contribution in 1997, Henry Manny's summer programs had trained more than 2 of every 5 sitting federal judges. In other words, a stunning 40% of the U.S. judiciary, federal judiciary, had been treated to a Koch-backed curriculum. Building on those earlier investments, in 1997, Koch gave this $10 million to support a new James Buchanan Center for Political Economy. And he made clear in giving this first of many gifts that Buchanan's theories and implementation strategies were the right technology, to use his favored phrase, but the professor's team, he made clear, had not used the tools forcefully enough to create winning strategies. The operatives that Charles Koch put in place on the campus would. One of them was the aptly named Richie Fink. There is Richie Fink talking about how these campus investments, which have grown exponentially over the last few years, how these campus investments are critical to the whole political operation. They supply the think tanks, they supply the pipeline of young talent, and they cooperate with the political spending to win radical policy change. So, with this respectable base camp secured, minutes from the Capitol, Koch would turn to assembling what he said he wanted to do when he gave that first big gift, with a proclamation that he said, "I want to unleash the kind of force that propelled Columbus to his discoveries." He has also compared himself to Martin Luther. So this is a man of no mean ambition and quite a lot of audacity. I should point out, too, as I gestured to before, this Koch presence on campuses is surging now. There's a great youth group I can talk about in the discussion called Unkoch My Campus, but they're wonderful. They have, sorry, I've got some extra slides in here that are more for university audiences. This is what Koch funding looks like from 2005, over a decade. You can see the escalation. It is radically going forward. And the faculty in these operations push out ideas and that legitimize the work of all of these kinds of groups that you probably are familiar with. And the agenda that these groups promote. The agenda is things like privatizing Social Security and Medicare, dismantling the public sector, transforming our higher education system. I mean, it is so radical. And it will result, I believe, in an utterly unsustainable society by every measure. Now, in closing, let me pull the lens out from the campus outpost to this overall project of social and political transformation that the Koch Donor Network is funding and promoting. Because when I brought back the hundreds of documents that I had copied at Buchanan House and put them together with other sources, I found myself laying down pieces of a puzzle that literally astounded me in its scope and in its audacity. It now encompasses dozens, we can bring them some, oh, there we go, there's our agenda, dozens of ostensibly separate national organizations, such as these, and if you include the state-level operations that make up something called the State Policy Network, your own affiliates in New York are the Empire Center for Public Policy. The associates are the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, the Moving Picture Institute, and the National Review Institute. Put those together, then also with the international affiliates of something called the Atlas Network that has 450 groups working in 90 countries, what you're looking at is hundreds of well-funded organizations working to radically alter government and society to bring this kind of unfettered, free-rein capitalism into being without being honest with the people, even with the people on whose votes they depend. As a historian of the South, I also came to realize something else as I was putting this together. That is that the form of government that these men see as ideal, as liberty, as the free society of their dreams, would be a lot like mid-century Virginia in all but the state-sponsored racial segregation. When James Buchanan set to work in Charlottesville in 1956, with an avowed mission to, in his words, preserve liberty, the verb matters there, that liberty was threatened by the civil rights movement, that state had just been identified by a great political scientist named V.O. Key as the most oligarchical state in the South and therefore in America. And V.O. Key, who had a rather wry sense of humor, said that next to Virginia, Mississippi is a hotbed of democracy. Think about it yourself, in light of what I've shared with you tonight and in light of what you've seen evolve over the last decade and more. What is the substance of this vision of liberty shared by Buchanan and Koch, but mid-century Virginia, the state subjected to what V.O. Key said was the most thorough control by an oligarchy? As I said, the state-mandated racial segregation would go. but we need to recognize that nearly everything else about the political economy of mid-century Virginia enacts their dream. Just some examples. The use of right-to-work laws and other ploys to keep working people powerless. The suspicion of public education as a source of subversion. The insistence that government should not be allowed to interfere with property rights to stop discrimination. The deployment of states' rights legal arguments to prevent the federal government from promoting equal treatment. The regressive tax system and refusal to make forward-looking public investments. The opposition to Social Security and Medicare, which was led in Virginia by, and I forgot to bring him, by Harry Byrd in the Senate and by Virginia's Howard Smith in the House. And of course, voting rights restrictions to keep those unlikely to support the system away from the polls, and lo and behold, gerrymandering to keep the remaining voters misrepresented, so that the moderate suburban and urban white voters, let alone the black voters, the moderate suburban and urban white voters would not be heard. And in fact, had they been heard, had they been represented, Virginia never would have had that massive resistance policy, scholars have shown. So in short, what you had in mid-century Virginia was, we are back to rules again. Rules that in combination ensured the uncontested sway of corporations and the wealthiest citizens. And the question this stealth plan that is underway now presents us with, once we know it, is, I believe, at one level, quite simple. And it is this: is the kind of world that these men are seeking to create, the kind of world that we want to live in and that we want to bequeath to our children and to future generations. That, I believe, is the real public choice. So I can take your questions, comments, challenges.
So thank you very much for shedding some light in some arenas that haven't received much. I've recently been somewhat encouraged by some federal cases that are beginning to challenge gerrymandering in half a dozen key states. And am hopeful that, of course, those will move in the right direction. And I'm wondering what you think of this moment in which those cases seem to be receiving a lot of attention. And because it would seem to me that to gain control of state constitutions, gerrymandering obviously is the way to do that.
Yes.
So is that something that perhaps is not as frightening as it may have been?
Yeah, great question. So the question was about some of the cases, the gerrymandering cases that are moving through the courts and beginning to have some success. So that is very encouraging, although it's not clear how successful they will be overall. There was just a success in Pennsylvania where the challenge involved the violation of Pennsylvania's own state constitution. So that won, and that was encouraging. There are other states, including my own, where that's not a violation of the state, or there hasn't been a successful argument made that the gerrymandering violates the state constitution. So we'll see what happens there. I do think that's encouraging. I do think it's important. I do think, we should all be following that litigation, but we will still be left with the voter suppression efforts. The Republicans have resisted, by the way, every time they've been told to draw fair maps, as in my own state of North Carolina, kicking and screaming, all kinds of problems with it. So it's been a challenge to even get them to obey the courts again. But so the gerrymandering litigation is encouraging. There have also been some successes in lower courts on voting rights issues. There was a judge in North Carolina, the North Carolina case, who said that the lines had been drawn with almost surgical precision to cordon off African American voters and dilute their voting power. So that's encouraging. But I do think we are faced with a Supreme Court in which this radicalized Republican Party has, for all intents and purposes, stolen a seat. right? And Neil Gorsuch will be the deciding vote, and he is deeply involved in this cause, committed to these ideas, so that is frightening. And there's also the Janus case coming up to the court about public sector workers, which the State Policy Network has talked privately about as being able, in their hopes, to deal a kind of death blow to public sector unions in the country. And by crushing those public sector unions, they're also weakening a critical source of interracial cooperation among workers, because unions are among the most integrated bodies in America today, and also important voter education and get out the vote efforts. So it's Wisconsin, as a classic example. Scott Walker made, as he put it, we dropped the bomb to debilitate public sector unions as a part of this project, and they've lost 30% of their voters, and you can see how that was part of the firewall in the Midwest that went down. So I think we should take encouragement from anything that we can, but I do also believe that this is an all-hands-on-deck emergency for the future of our democracy. This cause is infinitely well-funded, very determined, and working very strategically. And I think it's really crucial for people to pay attention, and if they're concerned, organize.
Oh, thank you. It was a brilliant elucidation of what's going on.
Thank you.
I really have, I guess, two questions. I watched, I think it was American Experience last night, and they talked about 1896 convention, and I think it was Lloyd George who raised the flag about Americans in chains, basically, the American workers. And this is so reminiscent of the social Darwinism.
Yes.
And at that time, both the Republicans and the Democrats were in the pay of corporations. And we came out of that,
Yes.
and Roosevelt ended up co-opting some of the workers' rhetoric. And so that gave me hope. And the second part, is it Reverend Samuel Barber with the Moral Tuesdays or Mondays?
Mondays,
And
yeah.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and what you see as the hope for us getting through this.
Absolutely. Well, I will say the single most important finding of my research, I believe, is that I have found the architects of this effort saying again and again in their own words that they understand that they are a permanent minority and that they will not persuade the wider public of their ideas if they are honest, right, and advocate for these things in their own names. And that is precisely why they have weaponized Buchanan's school of thought in this way that Koch refers to as a technology in order to radically change the rules of our society, to disempower the majority and move their project along. But so I take incredible hope from the fact that they're so frightened of the majority, right? That there is a majority of good and decent people out there in America who, if people, we're all so busy, right? Everybody's doing 1,000 things. Technology's coming at us. We've got the sandwich crisis, the care crisis, every other kind of, people don't even feel like they have the breathing room to stop and really pay attention to this. But when you do, and you see what's happening, I think that you will recognize that this is a crisis fully as important as the 1860s, when the property supremacists who organized the Confederacy tried to undermine democracy to save the institution of slavery. It is like the 1930s, when the property supremacists were not going to allow America to deal with the depression and the suffering that people were facing, but mass movements of workers and of retired people and of others began to change that, the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So I also teach the history of social movements. I have tremendous faith in the creativity and capacity of the American people and how contingency can work. So I do think there's a lot of hope. But again, I think it's going to be a massive lift to address this, but I think it can be done. And on that front, you were asking about Reverend Barber and the Moral Mondays movement, of which I was a part. It's really, really impressive. Reverend Barber has the most inclusive, capacious, kind of prophetic message of anyone that I've heard in my time. And so it's a really, really powerful call. And he and others, including the Reverend Jean Theroux Harris in New York, are launching a new Poor People's Campaign that they're going to start on Mother's Day, I believe, with a demonstration in DC. So I'd look out for that too. But I would also say, in a room like this, and every other one that I've got, constantly talking to audiences today, trying to alert people to this. But Everyone in this room has a history, has relationships, has organizational affiliations, maybe professional affiliations, maybe, congregations. Some of you are part of this congregation, some of you are part of others. Those are people, those are what we have to think about. We have to think about how do we alert the people that we know, the people that we care about, and then how do we think about ourselves and kind of inventory, ourselves to say, well, what are our skills? What are our talents? Where's our passion? Because this cause is coming at everything that citizen organizing has achieved over the 20th century, and I am not exaggerating. They are coming at workers' rights. They are coming at women's rights. They're, Planned Parenthood. They're coming at civil rights. They're coming at environmental protection, at public health, at all of these things. So whatever you feel passionate about, I think people, can work in the domains that make sense for them, use the skills that they have, but I think the crucial thing to do is break down the silos that have existed on the progressive side for so long and have us begin working together, reaching out, informing one another of what we're doing, working more cooperatively to deal with this thing. And then I think if we do, we really can reinvent our democracy. I think many people have understood for decades it's going in a really not good direction, right? We have chronic problems as well as the acute ones. And so I think in dealing with this, if we do it creatively, forcefully, with compassion and energy, we can also deal with those chronic issues.
I was married to a libertarian for 22 years, and that's why my mouth dropped open a couple of times, because I lived with all of this for a long time, and everything you're saying resonates very close to home. And I've heard this, and I recognize I've been to meetings and organizational meetings, and I know I've seen this firsthand, and so I'm rattled by this, but I'm also very aware, and I saw firsthand how very organized this is. And so I'm going to my local Westchester Indivisible group, and I'm doing what I can to get state legislation changed and get Astorino out and George Latimer in and people like that. It still seems like a drop in the bucket when you have the George Mason School of Law churning out lawyers. What are other law schools doing? What are other people who have perhaps more power than I have? It's hard for me to imagine they would, but who might have more influence than I have. Where is that voice and where is that organization? Can you point to that at all?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for sharing your personal experience. And I have to say, one of the interesting and gratifying things about writing this book is I've gotten many letters from all kinds of good people around the country and beyond, but I've also heard from some refugee libertarians. I think of them as people who, you could see why somebody, might be drawn to ideas that say you shouldn't have mass incarceration for people smoking pot. I know you're not. I know, I got that. But, anyway, there's lots of ways in which, especially I think for young people who are idealistic, you could see how somebody could be drawn to this. But what I've heard from the people who have left that cause is kind of what you're saying, that after they're in it for a while, they see, as you were talking about, the social Darwinism that drives the whole thing. There's always a slide from libertarianism into the alt-right because people find it too arid. And since they're saying that the capitalist system is absolutely wonderful without flaws, and the only flaws that are there are from government's involvement, then they have to explain why some people have poverty over generations, right? Or are not able to lift themselves up out of their circumstances in the way the libertarians prescribe. And so they slide off into the kind of racist thought that we associate with the alt-right. And it is true that they are really well organized. On the other hand, I've also observed some of these guys, and frankly, without the money, they wouldn't be much. I look at the creativity, the passion, the intelligence, the resourcefulness that exists on the progressive side of politics, and I just see some really extraordinary people. And these guys have a lot of money, but I think, when they are exposed, I really do think a lot of this is going to be like the emperor has no clothes, right? And they have a lot of other people who are enabling them. All those Republicans in Congress now, they know what's happened to their party, but they're not saying it to the rest of us, right? People who voted Republican all their lives are scratching their heads and saying, why did my party try so hard to pass health care legislation that never polled above 18% support? It was awful. Even Republicans hated it, but they were rushing it through because they're accountable to the right-wing donors now, not to the voters. So anyway, so I think there's a lot that we can do in the way of exposing things. And then also, I wouldn't count out your efforts in Indivisible. I think Indivisible has been amazing. The national organization, the local spinoffs, and the things that are going on now, especially in the last year, as the shock of the Trump presidency has moved so many people, particularly, but not only women, into action. And I think progressives should pat themselves on the back for stopping that awful healthcare legislation, right? I mean, they tried 3 times and they were defeated because of those phone calls, because of that organizing, because people did the work and showed up. That was huge. And Virginia just changed, they got people out, they knocked the doors, they did the deep canvassing, and they, in a single election cycle, closed the gap between Republicans and Democrats in a state that had long been dominated by the right. But I want to say, too, I don't want to make this just Republicans and Democrats. I don't even think these labels fit anymore. Liberals and conservatives? Really? Actually, those of us who are trying to protect the achievements of the 20th century could be called conservatives, right? And these guys are the radicals. So the language is not helpful in some ways, and I think that what may help us to move forward is a kind of values-based vision that links together all of these various things that we believe in terms of fairness and sustainability and individual dignity and collective power. So, again, I am provisionally hopeful. If people hear and understand what's happening, and they go into action, and they alert other people, I think we can stop it. If we just go back to looking at our cell phones and binge watching Netflix all the time, we won't get there. You've had your hand up.
I was just wondering if you could speak a little to Buchanan's ideas and where that comes from, where that sort of ideology comes from, and since you spent so much time with his work and his writing, where his motivations lie. Are they ones of personal greed, or it seems like it's a little grander? Is it malevolence, or I'm curious about where that comes from and why he was had the convictions that he did.
Such a profound question, and I have to say, as author, I have struggled with this, and I could explain it in different ways. I didn't put this in a book, but I'll say it here. It's striking to me how many of the architects of this cause seem to be on the autism spectrum. People who don't feel solidarity or empathy with others and who have kind of difficult human relationships sometime. And Buchanan's family, his grandfather had actually been a populist governor of Tennessee. There's an interesting story in the book about that and about what made him a one-time governor. But he ended up a very bitter man, but he was very well known, and Buchanan's own parents wanted him to go into politics and have a political career. His father was kind of a glad-handing guy who was very popular. And Buchanan says in his memoir, there were early misgivings about my personality. Like, they knew he would never make it in politics. But who knows? I mean, this is speculation, right? But a part of me, since you've asked me in the way that you have, a part of me feels like there was some kind of wound in him that he didn't rise to that. He couldn't be this political figure. And then he made his mission to kind of debunk the whole of politics, right? To show that nobody who was in it was good. So I don't know. That is speculation. But what I can say, too, is as a white Southerner of his generation, of a conservative bent, he was raised in this world that celebrated the Confederacy that we've lately seen so exposed in Charlottesville and elsewhere. He went to a state college in Tennessee that had a statue up of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the first Ku Klux Klan, was a revered figure. His own ideas and his thinking, he always said that he preferred the constitutional rules of 1900 to those of the 1960s. Those constitutional rules of 1900, if there's any legal folks in here, that was the Lochner Court, in which workers had no rights. The courts routinely threw out any reform legislation saying that it was a violation of free contract and property rights. And it was also the Plessy Court that upheld segregation nationally. You know, and it's funny because some of his friends, like if you look me up, the libertarian cause has gone nuts about this book. They really tried to kill it. But I think also he was somebody who was good to his own friends, you know, and his colleagues and his co-thinkers. And so some of them took umbrage at my book and saw me as trying to debunk him or something. I wasn't. I was trying to explain his project. But he was somebody who could be decent to the people in his own circle and was kind of a Southern gentleman. But he also could just go into blinding rages that led him to be pushed out of two universities, not by liberals, but by conservatives who came to understand that there was a difference between their pragmatic conservatism and his radical libertarianism, and that difference mattered for their quality of life.
Starting with George Mason, how much has this spread to other universities, and so that we've got this constant flow of these libertarians, autistic libertarians. But could you, and also the other thing is, watching what goes on in Washington, it's difficult to understand why the Democrats don't seem to see this picture that you're talking about. I mean, somebody should give everybody Democrat in Congress your book. I mean, seriously. So no, I've read it. It's fabulous.
Thank you. Yeah, so, and I realize I didn't answer your question over here about the law school dimension of this. So once again, I mean, this is not a huge movement in the legal academy. What they have done, the Kochs are very strategic. I'm told by these people who knew him and worked with him that he's also very cheap. I mean, you don't make that much money, by not counting carefully what your investments are. And they've understood that if they can get a few places, right, George Mason in particular, but a few other outposts, they don't need to invest in all of these other places, right? They need to have a few nodes where they really accomplish this stuff. So George Mason is the key legal base, but there are subsidized lawyers, Koch grantees in other law schools. Case Western University comes to mind. I would have to, kind of break them out from the other faculty. But where they have been influential is, again, because they have this laser-like focus on changing the rules. So another thing that Charles Koch boasts of having provided the seed money for is the Federalist Society, which I'm sure most of you have heard of. Well, the Federalist Society, from Ronald Reagan forward, has been vetting justices, right? And bypassing the American Bar Foundation, which always assessed them based on their competence, their records, et cetera. This is more like an ideological test that they go through. And so the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation, which Koch now supports, has been vetting judges for the Trump administration. And thanks to all the judgeships that they wouldn't let President Obama get through, which he was entitled to, Donald Trump now has appointed more judges than anyone in modern history because of those. I think of them as stolen seats. I find these people totally illegitimate, but these guys have really thought about the rules, right? The Federalist Society is a credentialing body. The Heritage Foundation, supplying the guidance to presidents on whom to name. And so they've achieved an influence over the courts that is not representative of the legal profession or the legal academy. And so one of the things I'm trying to do, in my speaking is figure out ways to reach people who are in the legal profession and alert them to this, because I think many lawyers and certainly many professors of constitutional law would be blindsided and shocked by this constitutional convention business and would really find their voices if they understood it. But it's a question of, how to break in. I also want to say on the encouraging dimension, that states can authorize these can authorize a constitutional convention, but they can also rescind their authorizations. And Common Cause, among others, but Common Cause has really been leading this fight to get states to rescind their authorization. So they've gotten 4 states to rescind, most recently New Mexico. Now the problem is the right keeps fixing the rules in states to get more. So Wisconsin, Scott Walker's Wisconsin, just authorized after New Mexico withdrew its authorization. But that's another thing. That's another thing that And there's the logo for Uncoke My Campus, which I really do hope you'll check out. They're really wonderful. And they really need support, too. They have an incredibly talented staff, but it's really small. But they are among the best researchers on the Cokes. Journalists are going to them for their information. They know this thing like nobody's business, and they are the only group in the country focused full-time on this Coke threat to higher education and democracy more generally. So I can't say enough good things about them. I hope you'll check them out. Oh, the Democratic Party, yes, the Democratic Party. I think something's happening both within the labor movement and the Democratic Party, where the people who are the top leaders are just not sure how to deal with what's coming at them, and there's a kind of circle the wagons mentality instead of organizing. As somebody said to me, they have just enough to fear losing what they have and not enough to win. It was speaking of labor, but I think that we're seeing something happening in the labor movement that's also happening with these Indivisible and other groups, which is that these bodies are being reinvented from the fingers and the limbs in. And as a historian and somebody who studied social movements, that's how it happens, right? You know, the leadership of the AFL did not want to organize workers in mass production in the 1930s. You know, it took the outliers to do that. So the Democratic Party is, and the Democratic Party is caught up in a system in which there is, tons of money going into our politics, right? And tons of dark money going in on the right. And so what happens is the Democrats look to big donors, right? And their big donors are the financial sector or the technology sector, which is bringing us the gig economy, which has its own issues. So I think, until we deal with some of these issues about money in politics, it's going to be a challenge. But I think legislators, when they hear from their constituents, they take it to heart. So I think the more that people organize and raise their voices and alert people, the better. And actually, I can tell you that Virginia indivisible groups that I spoke to got copies of the book and sent it to all their state legislators and their congressional representatives saying, you have to read this. And I have actually visited with one U.S. senator and some chiefs of staff. So their message is getting out a little bit. Yes, sir.
I recently saw a list of representatives who are leaving Congress.
Yes.
And it was in coded red and blue.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of reds. And I was wondering if you had a comment on that.
Yes, I absolutely do, and I'm really glad that you raised it. My first comment is to say we should all be pushing journalists to say to these people, not let them go gently into that good night, but say, tell us, what have you seen? What's going on in your party? Because I know from my research that what this donor network has done in its weaponizing of Buchanan's ideas is apply this maxim of his that, again, if you don't like the outcome, change the rules, also change the incentives. So what this Coke Donor Network has done, and they have now organized this kind of grassroots army in Americans for Prosperity. They misinform them regularly about what they're really doing. I know because I'm on their mailing list. I know what they tell them. But they are effective in deploying them. But the main thing that they're doing is using the huge amounts of cash that they've raised to run primary challenges against any Republican who doesn't toe the line that will make their life bitter hell, and they'll provide dark money support to those who will toe the line. So just to give you an example of how effective this has been, in the early 1990s, there was no difference between our two major parties in their understanding that what was then called global warming, less climate change, but that was a real threat, and it was caused by human activity, and we needed to do something about it. They differed in the ways that you would predict, but they both agreed that it was man-made and needed attention. This Coke Donor Network is heavily based in the fossil fuel industry, right, and pushing an agenda there. Well, thanks to the threat of primary challenges and the dark money, by 2014, I think this is the right statistic I have in the book, but by 2014, only 8 of 278 Republicans in Congress would admit that climate change was man-made. So that's what the Donor Network is doing. And they actually boast about it. Another Coke official spoke of these primary threats that they can use with these vast pools of cash as the accountability play. He said, this is our accountability play. He said, it's our secret sauce, so to speak. So what they've done with those, again, is make the Republican officials accountable to the donors, the arch-right donors who are far to the right of Republican voters, not to the voters. And so I think that they've also, I mean, Grover Norquist actually called for, and I think it was in the 1990s, he said, we want to, what did he say? We want to turn the state capitals into, he didn't say cesspools, but something like that, of nasty, bitter partisanship. This, I know, is a direct quote, nasty, bitter partisanship. And I think that's what they've done in the state capitals, and that's what they've done in Congress, and the Republicans who are getting it in the neck for not towing that line just want to get out. But I think they owe a duty to the rest of us, a patriotic constitutional duty, especially given what's going on right now, to tell us what's going on there. Because, for example, John Boehner, he described Ted Cruz as Lucifer in the flesh, right? I mean, he has many other quotes like that. Orrin Hatch, at one point when they ran against him, he said, these people aren't Republicans, they're not conservatives, they're radical libertarians. I hate these people. But now he obeys them, and he's the one who kept Merrick Garland from getting a hearing. So we have to hold them accountable, and I'm so glad you raised that issue, because I think everywhere people can, they should be saying, why are you leaving? What did you see? You know, stop covering up for your party and tell us.
Over here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Hello.
was really excited when your book came out, and I immediately Googled you. I did come across these very in-depth criticisms or critique, and some of which you answered, some of you didn't. Could you comment on that? Because anyone else is going to do what I did, Google you and see extensive critiques from libertarians that you were unfair in your book.
So basically, these libertarians, most of whom are in the ones who are scholars, who are, Koch grantees, the professors who are Koch grantees are either economists or legal scholars, and they reason from first principles. They do not deal with evidence. So they basically, I don't think they understand what a historian does. So they basically accused me of practicing my craft, which I've done and had a pretty good record over the years, in doing what historians do, which is to do close readings of primary sources in context, which requires some inference. You have to have a deep knowledge of your context and your subjects and things like that. But they basically think that you should just be aggregating things, just like pasting documents together. So, I mean, I can give you one example. One of these people who also didn't let his readers know that he was at the 2010 Koch Donor Summit running a meeting. His name is Russ Roberts. He's at the Hoover Institution, used to be at George Mason. But he said Nancy MacLean owes Tyler Cowen, who's their big media person who's worked with Koch for 25 years at George Mason at the center. He said Nancy MacLean owes Tyler Cowen an apology because I didn't quote like this full document that he had where he talked about places where their freedom agenda had advanced, that you had often seen checks and balances being undermined and blah, 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 and I quoted that to point out, and frankly, we're seeing it now. But anyway, so that was the kind of critique that was out there. And initially, I did want to answer them, but my publisher told me that they were siloed, that they were libertarians talking to other libertarians and putting out a lot of smog. But when I saw them, they were so spurious and dishonest and misleading and often misquoting me, and a lot of them hadn't even read the book before they trashed it. One of them later admitted that after saying that the book should be pulped, I should be fired, and that the book was a reason that the National Endowment for the Humanities should be abolished, not reformed. So these are the kind of people I'm dealing with them, or was dealing with. So anyway, I responded in a piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education, but also, as I suggested, I've made a lot of wonderful new friends from this book, and among them are some of these young Koch researchers, both at Unkoch My Campus and Greenpeace, and they have produced a media tracker on the book that shows, it's like there's all this overwhelming positive, coverage, excerpts, reviews, interviews, blah, 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 and then there's this negative stuff that you're talking about. What they found was that 91 of 102 of these negative pieces, some of them really scurrilous and scandalous, but anyway, 91 of 102, I think it was, had come from people who had Koch funding, who were not declaring their conflicts of interest. So, my attitude is, I don't know, read the book, read the critiques, decide for yourself, see what you think. But I will say also that these young researchers who come from the environmental movement reached out to me because they said what was being done to me was what this Koch cause does to climate researchers, where they try to act as though, they try to find like chinks, things they think are chinks in the armor, make a big deal of them. They're very skilled at the Google algorithms of feeding things into a particular source to drive it up, in the ratings. But they try to create smog, right, to make something sound controversial when it's not, when it's very well documented and it's very, very well researched, and that's what they do. So there's even an environmental blog that's called Desmog Blog that fights this climate science misinformation. So anyway, I feel very confident of the strength of my research, and if they don't like it, I encourage them to write their own book, to go and become historians and do the research, as actually some of them are on retainer from Koch.
Hi. The Atlantic just recently came out with an article in which they say boycott the GOP. And I don't know if you've heard it. I thought it was really interesting. And it's written by two people who are not partisans. In fact, some actually adhere to some of the Republican policies. But they said not to get rid of the GOP, but to save the GOP. They said if you believe in democracy, in other words, vote for anybody who isn't a Republican, even in all the elections, even if it's a Republican you like, who is good, simply because the party has been taken over by the forces you're talking about. So I thought it was I've sent it on to people because I thought it was an interesting article. I was just, if you haven't heard about it, I was just wondering if you had heard about it.
I haven't heard about it, but it sounds interesting, and I can certainly see where it's coming from. But, I do worry because, I think, I'm a progressive person myself, and I've been an activist. I was involved in the Moral Mondays movement. But I can understand that sometimes, whatever, we can all err, right? And it's good to have somebody else to check us, right? Or to see if we're overreaching or if we're creating, or whatever. I think we need a kind of healthy tension in our politics, but one that also is honest and open and involves debate and compromise. And what is so terrifying, really, to me as a citizen, as I watch these guys, is that these people are dead set against compromise. I mean, they think compromise is the worst sin in the world, and they will, just ride roughshod over anyone. And they are destroying this party. And I mean, we see this horrible phenomenon right now, right, with what President Trump is doing, and the Republicans don't challenge him because they know this Koch agenda is going through under him. And so that's another thing. I mean, this Koch agenda is racing through under Donald Trump while the media thinks the Koch story is over, and now it's Donald Trump's tweets all the time. So I've actually encouraged people to just try this activity. It'll be so good for your mental health, for your digestion, for other things. Time out Trump. Take a week. Pay no attention to that man. Don't follow any of his tweets. Don't follow any of the news commentary about whatever he's done that day or that week that has people in an outrage and uproar. Instead, pay attention to the areas that you care about. Maybe the Department of Justice, the EPA, the Labor Department, the Education Department, the courts, what's going on in your state. We are all being played. We are being conned, I think, by this guy who's always creating distraction, and we are not paying attention to the things that we need to, which is what is being done to the commons in our country and to our democracy. So,
Nancy, how are you faring? You've been going for an hour and a half now.
we can stop here, and talk more informally. Great. Yeah. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you for these great questions. I can tell you're really engaged and you're really people who care about what's happening. So please just help spread the word and alert others.